Well, one thing about Mark's Gospel, which some of you may be pleased to hear, is it's by some way the shortest of the four Gospels. So if you're thinking of sitting down and reading a Gospel from beginning to end, Mark is maybe a good one to start with. All of the Gospels have their different characters. I've put up on the screen an illuminated page from a medieval manuscript. So a picture of Mark just before the Gospel starts. So you would have read Matthew's Gospel. You would then come to this page with St. Mark there writing his Gospel before you turn the page to begin reading the Gospel. You'll notice at the top of the page a lion. You maybe know that the Gospels, each of the evangelists has a different symbol, and traditionally the symbol for Mark is the lion. So you'll see the lion at the top holding a scroll, and opening the scroll, we see the very first verse in Mark's Gospel. And the very first verse in Mark's Gospel is this: the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Every Gospel, as I said, has its own character. Some people love Luke's Gospel because it begins with the infancy narratives. We learn about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. We hear about the shepherds coming and finding Jesus in a manger. In Matthew's Gospel, before we hear Jesus speaking at all, before his preaching and healing ministry begins, we hear, for example, about the wise men who follow the star. In John's Gospel, we have that beautiful prologue. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word became flesh and came to dwell among us. In Mark's Gospel, we have something very much more succinct. We have this single verse, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then we hear about John the Baptist, and the Gospel begins. In a sense, we might be kind of a little bit disappointed that we've only got this one verse, but I think the beautiful thing about this verse is it's something we can return to the whole way through the Gospel. We'd be quite likely maybe just to skim over that verse and to start reading. But this evening, I'd like to encourage you not to do that. I'd like to encourage you to kind of stay with this verse and to keep coming back to it, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, weekday readings, we've been hearing St. Paul recently quite often using that word gospel. Sometimes we translate it good news. It comes from the Greek word euangelion, which very early in Christian times became very specifically used word. St. Paul loved to use this word gospel. And for St. Paul, it was something very, very special. It was, although it was used in the world around him, it became something that he used to talk about something very particular. He used it to talk about the faith that we receive, the truth that we receive, the light that we receive. St. Paul talks about a gospel almost as if it's something tangible, almost as if you can hold it and pass it on. He's received this gospel and he passes it on. At the beginning of the letter to the Galatians, St. Paul constantly tells them, don't muck around with it. Don't change it. Don't tinker with it. This is something precious that you receive, that I receive, that we pass on. And we find salvation in this gospel. He mentions that in a whole number of places, but I think that's quite important for us to remember. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Just move on before I kind of talk about that again. So back to that picture. So that's what's written at the very top. And as we look at this illuminated page with the kind of gold leaf that's in there, kind of gives us a sense of expectation before we turn the page over. The Gospels, as we see in medieval times, were really believed to be something almost like a treasure, something so precious and something to be treasured. I think that's why it's so good for us to look at these medieval manuscripts. We get a sense, how did these people at that time feel about the Gospels? We can look also at some of the covers that were put on the books of the Gospel. Look at this one covered in jewels, and we see it there, but we get a sense these people saw the Gospels as a treasure, something so precious. And Mark's Gospel is something precious, but we'll maybe get an idea of why they treasured each Gospel so much if we think back to a time before they were able to put jewels on the covers of the gospel before they were able to create illuminated manuscripts? What was it that people treasured? And I want to take just a little moment to think back to those very earliest days when the apostles, when the disciples of Jesus were sent out into the world to preach the gospel, to proclaim the gospel. And we have a number of texts in the early church that really give us a sense of just how people took every opportunity that they could to listen to the apostles, to the disciples, to other people who had been eyewitnesses, people who had listened to Jesus. Every time they had an opportunity to go and listen to them, they took that opportunity and they treasured that opportunity. They wanted to come as close to Jesus as they possibly could by listening to what the people who had known him had to say. That is what people treasured, and that's what the gospel of Jesus Christ is. In the next generation, we kind of get a sense of not only in that first generation when the apostles were traveling around from one church to another, from one town to another, that generation, people wanted to listen to them. News would get round that one of the apostles was coming and people would gather to be able to listen to them. But in the next generation, there was the same kind of eagerness there for people to go and listen to those who had known not Jesus himself, but the apostles and the other disciples. I'm just going to give you a little word by a bishop, a very early bishop called Papias. And he speaks about listening to those people who had known the disciples of Jesus, those who remember, he calls them. If anyone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way. So he talks about waiting. And if anyone was going to come and pass through his town, he inquired about the words of the elders. That is what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. Get that sense of kind of excitement. They wanted to listen. And I think sometimes we forget about that whole era. We kind of jump straight from the time of Jesus to where we are now. We forget that there was that whole period in the early church where people who had known Jesus were moving around. And then after that, where people who had spoken to people who had known Jesus were moving around. And in the early church, that was something that was treasured, because those memories, those witnesses, those people that were speaking, put the rest of us, if you like, into contact with Jesus himself. Here's another early bishop, Irenaeus. He recalls speaking to somebody called Polycarp. Polycarp, we know, was very close to John. But this is what he says. I distinctly recall the events of that time. I can tell the very place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit as he discoursed. He would tell of his conversations with John and with the others who had seen the Lord, how he would relate their words from memory. So this is Irenaeus saying he'd sit there listening carefully to everything that Polycarp could tell him about what John said about Jesus and the others who had known the Lord. What the things were which he had heard from them concerning the Lord, his mighty works and his teaching. Polycarp, as having received them from the eyewitnesses. To these things I used to listen diligently, even then, noting them down, not on papyrus, but in my heart. He listened to these things, he remembered them, he treasured these things in his heart. Why have I spent this time speaking about this? Because the Gospels that we have today were written, in a sense, to replace those witnesses. At the time when those witnesses were beginning to die, some of them martyred, the early church realized we need to have exactly what they provided, kind of authoritative testimony. Instead of going to the people like Polycarp, to be able to go to the actual gospel. Instead of sitting at Polycarp's feet, to be able to turn to a book, to listen to somebody reading from a book. And these books were written to fulfill this purpose. The Gospels were not written the day after the ascension of Jesus. They were written a little bit of time later, but to step into the gap, if you like, left by those people that had borne witness to Jesus. Here we have a picture of St. Peter, and I'll explain a little bit more about why St. Peter later on, but there's St. Peter standing and preaching, possibly in Rome. He's standing and he's preaching to people. Clearly, he's telling them about Jesus. And when we read the Gospels, it's so good for us to think back and to remember, how did these words come to be written down? They came to be written down because Peter, for example, and the others will have told people, this is what Jesus said. This is a healing miracle that I saw Jesus carry out. This is the parable that I heard Jesus tell, and him passing it on. So we see St. Peter preaching, as Jesus had sent him out into the world to do. But on the left-hand side, you'll notice there, sitting down with a book in his hand, St. Mark. And the tradition of the church, going right back to Papias, who we heard from earlier on, tells us that St. Mark was what he described as the interpreter of Peter. St. Mark, he tells us, did not know Jesus himself, but he knew and was a companion of Peter, and he wrote down the things that he had heard from Peter. Mark we hear about in the first letter of St. Peter. We hear about him in the Acts of the Apostles. We hear about him in some of Paul's letters. And the tradition of the church, questioned by certain academics kind of about 100 years ago, but we can leave that to one side for the moment because many academics are coming round more and more to the opinion that the ancient tradition is kind of something that we can rely on, that is quite trustworthy. So there's St. Mark writing down the words of St. Peter. There's an incredible writer, academic, who's writing at the moment, who was at a certain time, reasonably recently, professor of scripture at St. Andrew's University. And he has kind of wonderful book that he has written, which is called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he writes a lot about Mark's gospel and how he believes that in Mark's gospel, we find the witness of St. Peter, how St. Peter would have proclaimed the gospel, spoken about the things that Jesus said and did. Mark wrote it down. But the interesting thing about what Richard Bauckham tells us in his book is that Mark actually gives us indications in his gospel that it's Peter's witness mainly that he's writing down. His research has kind of shown that at that time in historical works, particularly historical works describing different battles and wars, the writer would note down at the beginning and the end of any particular section the name of the person that he had listened to. They would just bring that name into the story at the beginning and at the end. And what you'll notice in Mark's gospel is the first of the disciples to be mentioned is Peter. Remember how Jesus is walking along by the Sea of Galilee and he calls Peter, Simon, as he's called then, and his brother Andrew. At the very end of the gospel, we see the women who go to the tomb, they find the empty tomb, and the angel or the character that's in the empty tomb says, go and tell the disciples and Peter. So kind of there's a sense, little indications that are there throughout Mark's gospel, but particularly at the beginning, at the end, saying, here we've got something that brings us close to what Peter told us. Let's have a little look. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read about how Peter says that they're needing to find an apostle to replace Judas. And this is the kind of person that Peter wants to find. One of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us. One of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. So for St. Peter, it's so important that the apostles are people who are able to go out and preach because they were with Jesus from the moment of the baptism in the Jordan up until the time of the ascension. And if you think about Mark's gospel, unlike any of the other gospels, it begins precisely there from the baptism of John and it goes right up to the ascension. That's the period, unlike St. Luke, who goes away and finds out about the birth of Jesus, or Matthew, or different kinds of approaches. But in Mark's gospel, it's very clearly exactly what Peter has said is essential for the preaching of the gospel, from the baptism up until the ascension. In Mark's gospel, it's very clear that Jesus is specifically doing this. He's creating round about him a group of people who are going to be able to go out into the world and speak about him. And all of this we need to keep in our minds as we think about what is the gospel that we're listening to. Why are we listening to this gospel? We're listening to it because Jesus has prepared everything. Here we're told in chapter 3 of Mark's gospel that Jesus went up into the hills. He called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed 12 to be with him and to be sent out to preach. So this is a crucial part of what Jesus is doing. He's calling people to be with him so that they can then go out and tell other people. Throughout the gospel, as we listen to it, and I hope this is something that will be really helpful to you as you listen, particularly to Mark's gospel, to think, how do we have these words? Think back to the picture of Mark sitting there and writing down as Peter spoke, all kinds of different situations. As we listen to them, we've got to kind of remember and put ourselves in the situation like the people who thought they were so privileged to be sitting at the feet of Polycarp or whoever else it was, because by sitting and listening, they were drawn close to Jesus himself by listening to the things that he had said and done. And as we listen to the Gospel of Mark, that's what happens to us. There are little clues and little signs all the way through Mark's Gospel that this is happening. Here's a little example for you. Remember how we're told of the storm on the Sea of Galilee, how the disciples are there in the boat and Jesus is there and they're kind of caught in this storm and they are terrified. Then it began to blow a gale. The waves were breaking into the boat so that it was almost swamped. But he, that's Jesus, was in the stern, his head on the cushion, asleep. See that little fact there that's just thrown in, that Jesus's head was on a cushion, asleep. Why do we need to know that? We don't really need to know that. But as we read that, and if you look in the other Gospels, in Matthew's Gospel, we're not told that, just told that Jesus is asleep. This Gospel, we're told his head was on a cushion, asleep. And there are little moments like this where just that reality creeps in, that sense where we can imagine, possibly behind this, Peter saying, we were there in the boat. The boat was getting swamped because of all the waves, because of the wind, and Jesus was there. And as Peter's kind of relating it, we get the sense as he remembers in his visual memory, the cushion there was a cushion. Jesus's head was on the cushion in the stern of the boat, and he was asleep. Watch out for little bits and pieces like that that come up in the gospel that just give you a sense and help us to imagine that we're listening to Peter or to one of the others, to someone who was actually there. And once we get that sense, we get, hopefully, as excited as Irenaeus or as Papias or these other people that really were desperate to listen and to hear what these witnesses, those people that were there, had to say. His head on the cushion, asleep. That's one of the details we find in Mark's gospel and not in other gospels. So it's a way in which a little bit of colour, it's not somebody kind of explaining or kind of reflecting or anything. It's just a little concrete detail. And if this was there the whole way through, we might think, well, this is just poetic writing going on. But it's not. It just occasionally, something like that creeps in that puts us in touch with those first disciples as they told the story of what they had seen and heard. Another little fact that comes up twice in St. Mark's Gospel is, we'll just have a look at at this story. So the daughter of Jairus, if you remember the healing of the daughter of Jairus, and she's dead, and Jesus goes and takes her by the hand and she stands up. But this is how the story is told in Mark's Gospel. Jesus allowed no one to go with him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. This is important as well. Again and again, Mark reminds us who is with Jesus, because he's reminding us who are the people who saw, who noticed, who watched, and who in turn passed on the story. Might have been Jairus himself who passed on this story, but Mark makes the point that Peter and James and John were there with him. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I tell you to get up. Once again, when we listen to that, what I hear when I'm listening to that is a sense of somebody telling the story. Somebody saying, we went in there with Jesus. He took her by the hand and he said, Talitha cum. Bear in mind, the first disciples of Jesus in Antioch or in Rome or wherever else they were, they'd have been speaking Greek or Latin in order to communicate with people. But that little phrase, which is then translated for us, which means little girl, I tell you, get up, is used in Aramaic, the language that Jesus himself would have been speaking. And the person telling the story gets so much into the scene as they remember it, that they remember hearing the exact words of Jesus as he speaks, Talitha cum. That's what Jesus said. It's like the people in the boat, and they remember, and there was a cushion, his head was on the cushion. It puts us into contact with what was happening. The same thing happens again, and I've just put it in brackets at the bottom, Ephatha, when there's a man who is deaf and a mute, and Jesus says to him, Ephatha, which means be opened. Again, it's one of those moments where the exact words of Jesus are repeated, even though the person telling the story would have been speaking a different language, because they're getting right back into the story again. And whenever we get these little moments, it helps us to get back into the story. These are real, ordinary people who were with Jesus, listening to him and watching him. And as we spend time in the company of these real people, then we get a sense of who Jesus is. Remember back at the beginning, what is this? The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Who is this? And we listen, and we get a sense as we listen to those people, those ordinary people that were with Jesus, what they saw and what they heard. Another little moment, which is the transfiguration. Again, as in the last one, Jesus takes with him Peter and James and John. As with the disciples, remember, we're told that he called these 12 to him, not just because he wanted them to be with him, that's partly it, because he wanted them to see him so they could go out and preach. He wanted them to be with him so that they could get to know him, so that through them, other people could get to know him. And this is precisely what happens at the Transfiguration, that remarkable kind of spectacular moment. He takes with him Peter and James and John. And if you remember, at a certain point, we're told this in Mark's Gospel, that Peter says, Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. This little occasion, and you can maybe play this game yourselves, not really a game, but it's kind of a game, where you read that and you think, right, if this is Peter telling us the story, which maybe it is, because he was one of the ones that was there, Peter and James and John, they're the only 3 people who witnessed it. So it must be one of them. And it seems as we're reading Mark's Gospel that it's Peter's preaching that Mark heard that were being given. So if it's Peter speaking, then he'd have been saying, and I said, Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And then you change the next bit as if Peter was speaking to say, I didn't know what to say. We were so frightened. And there's a lot of little moments in Mark's Gospel where we can do that. And it just feels so right and gives us the sense this whole story is being told from Peter's point of view, or one of the others. But if you change that, instead of saying he didn't know what to say, imagine Peter speaking to you. What's he saying? I didn't know what to say. We were so frightened. And the story kind of comes to life. We get put into contact with it. We get connected to it in a new kind of way. This sense that Peter is behind so much of Mark's Gospel, I find even more convincing from those moments in the Gospel where Peter cannot be the witness, Remember those last two stories we looked at? We're actually told specifically that Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. Peter was there. But a big and important section of this gospel, Peter is missing. Why is Peter missing, and when does he go missing? Look at this picture and you'll remember the denials of Peter, where Peter says, no, I don't know him. When Jesus has been arrested and Peter's there in the courtyard with the fire, I don't know him. I know nothing about him. And 3 times he denies. The cock crows and Peter weeps. From that moment, the events continue, leading up to the crucifixion and beyond that. So who's there? Who's telling us the story at that point? And what I find really convincing here is that if it's true that St. Mark is trying to give us little indications as to who his witnesses are, he makes a particular effort at that from this point. Remember, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Remember, as Jesus is going out to be crucified, he's carrying his cross, and we're told this. A lot of the way through Mark's gospel, he doesn't even bother to tell us who people are called. Sometimes if it's just a deaf person came, a paralytic, doesn't bother. Why does he bother to tell us that this person who carries the cross with Jesus is called Simon of Cyrene? Not only that, but he tells us that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Surely he's only telling that to the people that he's writing for if he thinks that they in fact know Alexander and Rufus, and they're in fact mentioned in the letters of St. Paul. So at this point, we're kind of given a little signal, a little indication. Here's the person that's watching now. But it's not only Simon of Cyrene, because as you know, at the foot of the cross, I don't know whether, I can't see the top bit, there we go. We're told there were some women watching from a distance. Among them were Mary of Magdala, Mary who was the mother of James the Younger and Joseph, and Salome. Mark doesn't tell us all the different people were there. Remember, in John's gospel, we're told about the beloved disciple and Mary. But here, Mark makes a point of specifying these 3 people, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. It's as if he's saying, these are the people who saw, and these are the people who therefore said what I've been able to write down in the gospel. Because this isn't just, and this is what we need to remember again and again, what we read in the gospel, what we hear in the gospel is what happened. Jesus wanted people to be with him, to see, so that they could say what happened. These are not just stories that sound nice for us. People in the early church were desperate to meet the disciples or people who had known disciples. Why? Because they wanted to know what Jesus had said and done. This is so crucial. And as we're listening to the gospel, we've got to get a sense that's what we're trying to do as well. We're trying to see, we're trying to listen, we're trying to get into contact with Jesus. But notice I've underlined in that first paragraph that Mark doesn't just give us the names of people who were there. He tells us they were watching. They were watching. We move on to when Jesus is laid in the tomb. This is the second paragraph, and we're told Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were watching. He doesn't mention Salome on this occasion, but those 2 were watching, and they took note of where he was laid. This is so important when we start to kind of listen and notice these things. We see them all over the place, these little signs that what we're listening to is like being with one of the people who was there. They took note of where he was laid. Again, when they go on the first day of the week, early in the morning, when they looked, all these verbs that tell us these are people who saw and took note. And that's why we're able to read this now. They could see that the stone, which was very big, had already been rolled back. They saw a young man in a white robe. See, this is the place where they laid him. You must go tell the disciples and Peter. I'm going to move on a little bit more quickly just now. Oh, it's... there we go. Okay, here is, so we kind of leave that to the side at the moment, but what's important in all of that, we have ordinary people watching and seeing. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We know about it because of those people that have heard and watched and seen and listened and all of that. Here is a dramatic, romantic style painting of St. Peter in Rome in the catacombs. And he's speaking to people, they're gathered round. And look at them and look at the kind of light. It's kind of dramatic kind of scene, almost as if they're being overwhelmed by the light. But the point I'm trying to make here is, why is it so important? Why were people so desperate to hear about Jesus? Why does it matter that what's in the Gospels is true? Why does that all matter? And that all matters because Jesus is the Son of God. And this is the kind of second really key thing about Mark's gospel that's there all the way through. One is the fact that ordinary people are witnessing this, and we're in contact with them by reading and listening to the gospels. Two, what they're a witness to is Jesus, who is the Son of God, the divinity of Jesus that's there throughout the gospel. Quite often people think, oh, it's just in John's gospel where we hear at the beginning, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we think, yeah, John's gospel is so full, one of the later gospels, of this sense of the divinity of Jesus, the Son of God. They're not reading the gospels carefully enough, because Mark's gospel begins with that sentence and is full of it all the way through. I'm just going to take you kind of on this page, on this slide, to the moment of the death of Jesus, where we're told the centurion who was standing in front of him had seen how he had died, and he said, truly this man was Son of God. We don't know, it's sometimes translated the Son of God, a Son of God. In Greek, there's no article. I won't go into all the differences about it, but he kind of notices, and it's key, and I'll come back to it, that it's at the moment of the death of Jesus that he recognizes that. But that takes us back, that phrase, Son of God, takes us back to the very beginning of the gospel and what we're told this gospel is. This gospel, remember what St. Paul saw, something we receive and treasure and pass on, tells us about and puts us into contact with Jesus, who is the Son of God. But these are just two moments, and I'm going to take a few moments just now to show you that the sense of Jesus as the Son of God is everywhere, on every page of this gospel. The very, very beginning, the first thing that we have is a quotation from the prophet Isaiah, prepare a way for the Lord. And it's almost as if at the beginning of the gospel, we're being asked to, right, you're about to start reading this. It's the Lord who's going to come. Of course, this prophecy is referring to John the Baptist, who's preparing people to meet Jesus. But this sense already, we're preparing a way for the Lord. Jesus is the Lord. He is the Son of God. John the Baptist speaking at the very beginning, we hear of John the Baptist baptizing people, and he already points to somebody who he says is more powerful than I am. I'm not worthy to kneel down and undo the strap of his sandals. Think of John the Baptist, the greatest of all the prophets that's being. He's saying, but I'm not even worthy to kneel down before this person. This is before Jesus even appears. There's the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan. And again, what do we hear? As the dove descends, we hear the voice from heaven saying, you are my Son, the beloved. God the Father saying, you are my Son, the beloved. Jesus, the Son of God. This is why people wanted to know. This is why they wanted to listen. This is why there had to be witnesses to tell us, who is he? As we move through the gospel, and very kind of short passages that we get, we move very quickly, one scene to another scene, to another scene, to another scene. Mark doesn't add anything. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't comment. He doesn't reflect. He just moves us on. And in a way that makes me trust the gospel so much, because Mark would have been quite capable, clearly an intelligent man, a companion of Paul, kind of adding all kinds of commentaries and different reflections. He doesn't. He just tells us what he heard and what he knows that Peter saw and the others, and passes it on. But here we have this sense, as Jesus teaches at the beginning, what people notice is he taught them with authority. Then we get a strange fact, which is, if you remember, and you'll notice it as the year goes on, and it's quite unsettling in a certain kind of way, We hear of Jesus casting out unclean spirits. We hear that the demons who are cast out by Jesus recognize him as the Holy One of God, as the Son of God, but he won't let them speak. And all the way through the gospel, we get this quite clear why he won't let the demons speak. It's not the demons who are going to bear witness to who Jesus is, but these ordinary people we've heard about, whose lives have been transformed, who've been filled with light because of the presence of Jesus. They're the ones who Jesus wanted to be with him and then to go out and preach. Not the demons, but as we read that, we say, yeah, okay, we know all the way through, this is truly the Son of God here. We're disturbed, we're unsettled, but we read that and we notice it. The calming of the storm, remember, just such a kind of down-to-earth moment that we noticed earlier on. His head was on a cushion. But then after he calms the storm, we're told the disciples in the boat were filled with awe. They said to one another, who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him. So typical of this gospel, but that moment where they're like, surely only God can command the wind and the sea. What's called a theophany, that like, this is God with us. Right next to the most trivial seeming moment, his head was on a cushion. And that's exactly what Mark's gospel is all about. Something kind of trivial, mundane seeming, and yet the presence of the Son of God. And it kind of tells us, we are ordinary people who'd notice a cushion. This message is for us as well. All the way through the gospel. So there are those moments where people like, surely he must be the Son of God. Surely there's something divine here. But there's also a way that Jesus speaks all the time that only makes sense if he truly is the Son of God. Do you remember the moment where Jesus is kind of criticized? Why do your disciples not fast? Why don't they fast? The disciples of John the Baptist are fasting. The disciples of the Pharisees fast. Why, Jesus, do your disciples not fast? And Jesus says, it wouldn't make any sense for them to fast. Surely the bridegroom's attendants would never think of fasting while the bridegroom is still with them. What's Jesus saying? How could anyone possibly fast when they're there with me? Who could say that? I often stop and think as I read these passages in the gospel, go back to any of the Old Testament prophets. None of them would have said anything like that. How could anyone fast when they're with me? They couldn't have said that. We have Jesus's humility that we see everywhere. The Son of Man came to serve, not to be served, to give his life as a ransom for many. And yet, again and again, he bears witness to his divinity. People could not fast while they're with me. It would make no sense. So either this is kind of blasphemous from Jesus's point of view, or arrogant or horrible, and none of these things go together with everything else that we see about Jesus's character. It only makes sense for him to speak like this if he truly is the Son of God. Same kind of thing happens with the anointing at Bethany. You remember when the woman comes in with the alabaster jar? In Mark's gospel, we're told that she anoints his head, and everyone's like, what a waste of money. This money could have been spent on the poor. And Jesus says she's done something so beautiful. You'll have the poor with you always. Look after them, but you won't always have me. Again, none of the prophets in the Old Testament, no one who just came along with some interesting teachings, nobody like that could have ever said that. It's worth it because it's me. We've got to get that in the right way, because the humility of Jesus is always there, but he bears witness to the fact of how precious it is for him to be there with them as the Son of God. And yet, again and again, when people seem to recognize and seem to notice and seem to suspect, he gives them strict orders not to tell anyone about him. And he does this, and we can't go into all of the details of this at the moment, but clearly people are expecting a Messiah who's going to liberate them from the Romans, a kind of Messiah who's going to lead an army. They need to wait until they've really got who he is. But also in terms of being the Son of God, somehow Jesus wants them to wait. And he wants people to wait instead of just arriving and saying, I am the Son of God. He wants people to wait and only recognize that at a particular moment where the mystery of who he is can really enter into their lives. And as we read Mark's gospel, we realize that mystery doesn't connect with them perfectly, not until after the death and the resurrection of Jesus. This is what he says to them after Peter has recognized that he is the Messiah, the Christ. The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. They will put him to death, and 3 days after he's been put to death, he will rise again. The transfiguration. Remember, we had that moment where Peter kind of says something and said, well, I didn't know what to say because I was, we were all so terrified. Another moment where from heaven, the voice of the Father, this is my Son, the beloved, listen to him. All the way through the gospel, I can't stress this enough, not just those parts of the different gospels that are kind of absolutely clear in stating the divinity of Jesus. The gospel makes no sense unless he is the Son of God. We have to keep going back to the beginning of the gospel. What is this? The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There are the words of the Father from heaven, again at the transfiguration, as they had been at the baptism. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. Kind of running out of time. I might possibly miss this. This is a beautiful moment in the gospel where Jesus quotes from one of the Psalms where David is inspired by the Holy Spirit and is speaking about the Messiah. And he says, the Lord said to my Lord, speaking to the Messiah, sit at my right hand. And Jesus says, David himself calls the Messiah, who's supposed to be the son of David, my Lord. How can this make sense? It's almost like that moment in John's gospel where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Jesus, the Messiah, was supposed to be a descendant of David, therefore someone almost as good as David, almost as amazing as David. But Jesus shows how in one of the Psalms, David has called the Messiah, this person who's supposed to be his descendant, my Lord. The Lord said to my Lord. Leave that on for the moment. Before the Sanhedrin. So remember, Jesus doesn't want to just go and proclaim his divinity. It's only in the moment of his passion, his death, and his resurrection that this mystery can be proclaimed. Everything else, if you like, is a preparation for that. Remember Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest asks him at this moment where Jesus is vulnerable, is weak, is about to be put to death. He asks him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And the Blessed One was a way of speaking about God. So he's asking him, are you the Son of God? And at this point, Jesus unequivocally responds, I am. But it's at that moment. And again, all of this in Mark's gospel, it's so that we don't confuse power. Remember how the disciples, they were arguing amongst themselves as who was the most important, who was the most powerful, all of that kind of stuff. The power of God, the presence of God is something completely different. And it's revealed in this way. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? I am. There we come back to kind of picture of Mark. There's so much to do. That's almost 45 minutes. But there is Mark. Look at the lion there, unfolding the scroll. That kind of, I love the fact that Mark has the lion as his symbol. I mean, the lion's there because the gospel begins in the wilderness and the lions were kind of crying in the wilderness. But there we've got the voice of one crying in the wilderness, which is John the Baptist. But we have this fantastic lion there, and he's opening up. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And you listen to that, you look at that and think, I've got to know about this. I've got to read this. I've got to find who this is. I've got to listen. Like Irenaeus, like the pious, those people that wanted to listen to people who knew Jesus. I need to listen to this. I need to discover the Son of God. Remember what Paul said, this gospel that's passed on, as it's passed on and received, not changed at all. And Mark's gospel, more clearly, I think, than any of the others, is how careful Mark is being not to add anything. And sometimes we get a bit, we think, gosh, he's just jumped from one scene and he's moved straight to the other. But when you read that, you can think, there's something beautiful, because Mark is not going to add anything. This is too sacred. This is too precious to tinker with. I'm just going to pass it on. And if you accept it and read it and connect to the Son of God in it, your life will be completely transformed. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So that's my kind of recommendation. Keep going back to that first sentence. Throughout the gospel, there'll be bits you don't understand. Don't worry about it. The disciples are presented to us. Remember how the witnesses are there as ordinary people. They notice the cushion. Peter says something stupid. Peter denies Jesus. All of this, again and again, the disciples in Mark's gospel fail to understand things, but they stay with him. And that gives us courage as well. I don't understand this, but I'm going to hang on in there. I know this is the right place to be. Peter knew that. This is where to be. This is who I need to listen to. People leave, people stop following, all that kind of thing. We read that in John's gospel. Peter knows this is where to be, even though he gets things wrong, even though he doesn't understand things, even though he even denies that he knows Jesus. He hangs on in there. And that's the message that's there throughout the Gospels. That picture is a beautiful one to remember as well. Peter's preaching, Mark there. It's not always Peter, but a lot of it is. But the important thing is to remember behind every word that's written in this Gospel, there's somebody who was there. Every word that we read in the Gospels, behind it, there's someone who was there. Maybe it's Simon of Cyrene, maybe it's Peter, maybe it's Jairus, maybe it's the women at the cross. But every word behind them is someone who was there. And as we listen to it, we connect. I'm going to finish just with that stained glass window from St. Margaret's Chapel at the top of Edinburgh Castle, because I love it. And I love it because she's got the book, she's reading the Gospels, or she's been reading the Gospels, but she looks up and look at her face in that, and particularly when the light's coming through the window. She's filled with light because she's been listening to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And St. Margaret's life was utterly transformed by that. We read all over the place of her kindness, of her goodness, of her energy. Where did she get it all from? Answer, the gospel. She read it. She read it and she was connected. And that is part of God's plan. That is what Jesus's plan was. He called to him people that he wanted to be with him so that they could go out and preach. And we might say, well, that's all very well for all of those people who met those disciples. But no, we've been given the same thing. But instead of those disciples and those eyewitnesses, we've been given the book of the Gospels, and in year B, the book of Mark's Gospel.
Show your appreciation for Father Andrew for a fantastic talk.